Rabbi Rami Shapiro is an award-winning author of over 36 books on religion and spirituality. He received rabbinical ordination from the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, and holds a PhD in religion from Union Graduate School.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron Trimble. I am CEO of Convergence, and I am honored to be in conversation with Rabbi Rami Shapiro, who the two of us, we have done one program together with Matthew Fox. It was a teach-in, eight hours, I think, of teaching that you and Matthew led. And I thought it was just magic. I had the best time learning from you. So on this topic, future spirituality, I thought we've got to have you as a part of this, mostly because I want to geek out together. So I'm very grateful for this. Rami, why don't you tell us a bit of your background, who you are, what you would want us to know about you, and then we will jump in.
Okay, well, I'm not sure exactly what helps to know as far as background, but keeping it very simple, I grew up in a modern Orthodox Jewish home. I didn't find that at all meaningful when I was a kid. In high school, I discovered Zen Buddhism and Hinduism and started moving in that direction. I got a degree in Buddhist studies, an undergraduate degree in religion with a concentration in Buddhist studies. But I was working primarily with a Zen master, Joshu Suzaki Roshi, who at one point at the end of a sesshin, an intensive meditation session, demanded that I give up my academic career and move to the monastery and study Zen with him. And I'm so grateful for him doing that because it made very clear to me that I didn't want to do that. So I said to him, unbeknownst, no preconceived notion of this at all, but I said to him, Roshi, I can't do that. I'm going to become a rabbi. That was not my plan. I was going to become a PhD in Buddhism and teach Buddhism. And I said, no, I'm going to be a rabbi. And so he says, oh, be a rabbi, be Zen rabbi. I said, okay, that's my career path. I'm going to be a Zen rabbi. I don't know what that is, but it sounds better than, whatever else I was thinking at the time. So I went to rabbinical school. I'm most interested in the mystical aspect of things, and eventually came upon what I call perennial wisdom, which are the fourfold teachings that are at the mystic heart of every religious tradition. And very simply, number one is that all life is a manifesting of a singular aliveness. You can call it God, Tao, Mother, Brahman, whatever. Second is that you and I have an innate capacity to awaken to this fact. The third is that when we awake to the fact that we're all part of this divine happening, we feel an inner calling to do what the Bible calls in Genesis 12:3, to live as a blessing to all the families of the earth. And then the fourth point is awakening and living as a blessing are together comprise your highest calling as a human being. So that has informed my personal spiritual life and my professional life for decades. And then the only other thing I would add to that is all by herself, without any prompting from me or without any grounding in any religious tradition that I have studied or been initiated into, I began to have visions, audio and visual, of the Divine Mother in many forms, whether it's Mary in the Christian tradition or Kali in the Hindu tradition. But I have become, really because of her and not because of a choice I made, a devotee of the Divine Mother. So the fourfold perennial wisdom path combines, in my mind, or at least in my experience, with my devotion to the Divine Mother. And that basically defines who I am spiritually.
I want to be you when I grow up. I want to make sure, I love your path. I want to make sure, so I in order to become more like you, have been reading all of your stuff. So I want to make sure that everyone knows of all of this great work. And today probably we'll have a deeper conversation into the Perennial Wisdom book that you've compiled, but you also wrote a book on the divine feminine, which is a really fantastic resource. And in fact, that was the topic of the course that we worked on together. So if people are interested in more information, they can check that out. So again, I just am struck by, of all the people who have some intuition about the future of spirituality, or what we would want or wish to see within the future of a thriving spiritual expression. Maybe that's a more accurate entry into the question. What occurs to you? What seems important as we're thinking about this?
No, I love the question, but I love it as a contrarian.
Yes.
Because I don't know if spirituality has a future.
Okay, great.
What I mean by that is, I don't think spirituality is a thing that can have a past or a future. Spirituality to me is, well, it's more practice than anything else. It's not, and we can talk about the difference between religion and spirituality. I have a sense of that. But to me, spirituality is comprised of practices in which one can engage to prepare oneself for awakening to the non-dual reality that is in, with, and as all things. And that awakening, my guess is that awakening isn't different today than it was thousands of years ago, and won't be any different thousands of years from now, if there is humanity then, than it is today. Awakening is awakening. You awaken to this non-dual reality. I think what changes is how the awakening is lived. So this is what I have in mind. If you go back into any of the great religious traditions of the world, and you take the most enlightened people, my guess is you're going to find overwhelmingly that they're men. And number two, that they're steeped in a misogyny that they just accept as normality. So you can get people who are enlightened. For example, you can be an enlightened Tibetan Buddhist monk and yet still have the bias that raises a 6-year-old monk in a monastery above a 66-year-old nun in a monastery. There's just the built-in sexism of that tradition. And enlightenment or awakening doesn't seem to have much of an impact on that. Now that may be changing. In fact, that is changing. But that's the change that I would hope in the future, is that the awakening won't be any spiritually different, but it'll be socially different, that it'll shatter these ethnocentric, racist, misogynist, in some cases anti-Semitic, you can make a whole list here of limitations that society manages to cling to, even in those who are enlightened. Does that make sense?
It does, but it raises the question for me, because if one holds all of the isms that we've just named are built in that dualistic mindset, that frame. So what's a little confusing is, how can one claim enlightenment when you're still operating with these kinds of biases and still defending that kind of hierarchy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. You could take refuge in the Buddhist idea of the relative and the absolute, so they're awake in the absolute, but not in the relative. But I think that's somewhat of a cop-out. You get, there's a wonderful book called Zen at War, which is about Zen Buddhist teachers in Japan aligning themselves with the emperor and supporting World War II. Or you can take a look at this guy, Eugene Herrigel. I remember when I was in an undergraduate, one of the books that we read in our Buddhist studies program, one of the classes, was the Zen of Archery by Eugene Herrigel. And it's this great little book. I mean, partly it's great because it's really thin. I like thin books, so I can read them quickly. But it's this wonderful book about this German guy who goes to Japan to study archery and, according to him, becomes enlightened. And then the book ends. What you don't know, unless you do some further research, is after Enlightenment, he goes back home to Germany and joins the Nazi Party. How does he do that?
Great. Yeah.
Right? Is there a problem with his enlightenment? So I want to give him the benefit of the doubt in that there is some truth to his enlightenment, some authenticity to his enlightenment, but it wasn't strong enough or deep enough to free him from the social constraints under which he operated, Nazism. So that may sound, and I may just be missing the mark here, but it's a fact that so many of our so-called enlightened individuals have these problems, these social problems.
Right.
So hopefully the future would be that then maybe you could say then that the enlightenment or the awakening is deeper or broader, or maybe more, that the enlightenment is strong enough or becomes progressively stronger so that it shatters these social norms. I may just repeating my point rather than answering your question, but because it's a real challenge.
Right.
Well, and I'm not enlightened or awakened, right? I don't make that claim. But I'm constantly on the lookout for where I'm constrained by and I was going to say perverted, but that's probably the wrong word. Twisted by the norms of, my upbringing. Right. And you can't undo your psychology completely, right? I mean, it's still, you have to watch out for the crazy stuff that you were taught that's been embedded in your brain. But you can watch out for it. You can notice it. You can identify it. You can name it. And once you can name it, maybe you can free yourself from it. I mean, I used to think that awakening would shatter the whole thing, but I know too many people whose awakening I trust, but whose socialization I still find problematic.
Yeah. I'm hearing in the conversation that for you, spirituality isn't a thing, it is a way of being. And
yeah, I mean, I say practice. I really don't want to get away. I don't want to make it something ethereal.
Right.
A lot of people will tell me I'm spiritual, but not religious, which when you ask them what that means, comes down to a vague sense of, oh, I like everybody. I'm joyous. I'm happy. I'm a good person. I mean, that's fine. I mean, I'd like to have more joyous, happy, good people. But to me, that's a weak spirituality. Spirituality is work, but it's not work that guarantees you any result. It's the gift of awakening is a gift of grace and not a result of grit. And so, but I think the grit is necessary. I mean, I have my practices. We could talk about them if they're of any interest, but I have my practices that I do every day, and I don't expect anything from them. What I'm hoping is that they keep me open enough so that when the grace of awakening ripens, I'll be able to awaken with it, or however you'd put that.
Right. So I want to add one more element into the conversation that actually was what prompted me to choose this topic for this moment, because we are speaking as global warming is having its way with this planet, and human survival or planetary survival is a big question. We're also turning on our televisions and watching, a terrible war that's happening in Ukraine. When we think about spirituality as a way of being, as a practice, are there ways in which we might need to accelerate our awakening, or, what do we do in the face of these great existential challenges that maybe for the first time in human history, we have the capacity to destroy ourselves and this planet without the wisdom to know not to do so? Yeah. What's your advice for this kind of global consciousness transformation, if you will, that may need to be necessary in the face of these challenges, or maybe Maybe you've
Yeah,
got
no, I think it's a great question. Sadly, I think the answer is what you just said, a global transformation of consciousness, which isn't going to happen, right? I think that one of the insights that perennial wisdom offers and that awakening to that non-dual reality reveals to you is that if you continue polluting the ocean, you're killing yourself. If you cut down the rainforest, you're killing you're strangling yourself, you're suffocating yourself. The idea that it's all one system, the entire universe is one system, and that the health of a part depends on the health of the whole, then it would, if you really knew that, not as an intellectual idea, but as a felt reality, if you really knew that, you would do everything you could to be a blessing to all the families of the earth, human and otherwise. You would do everything you could to work toward a healthy planet, both environmentally, socially, culturally, et cetera. But we don't, because we don't really have that sense. I mean, we have so much information about the environment and what we're doing to it, and yet it's not enough to make us change, because information in and of itself doesn't make us change. Something has to shift in our consciousness. And that is the work of spiritual practice. I'd love to say it was the work of religion, and religion has lots of conferences about the environment and religion, but nothing ever changes, because religion is all about division and not about non-duality. So that, most religions, not talking about Western ones anyway, certainly Western religions have a distinct demarcation line between the human and the human world and the natural world. That we elevate the human above nature. Genesis, in the first chapter of Genesis, we talk about dominating. And I know there are other ways of reading the word dominion, but the way it's understood in popular culture for centuries, millennia, has been that humans are the top. We're at the top of the food chain, and we get to do what we want. And we thought we could get away with it. Now we know we can't get away with it, but we're so addicted to it, we can't stop. Whereas Genesis 2 gives us a totally different picture. Genesis 2 says that we are here to protect and to serve the natural world, not to dominate it. And the word that's used in the Hebrew for serve is the same word we use for worship. There's this sacred element to it. But our cultures are built on Genesis 1 and not Genesis 2. We've got to make that shift. There's something you can do even if you're not enlightened, if you're a clergy person, especially in the Jewish or Christian worlds, where you're talking about these Genesis texts, to point out the difference between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and then to toss Genesis 1 into the scrap heap of history and focus on Genesis 2 and the implication that we are responsible for the well-being of all beings, and that the world in which we live is a sacred place. So that's work you can do even if you're not, quote unquote, awake. I don't know if that's really answering your question, but on the larger scale, it's going to require, not everybody has to be enlightened, but there has to be we have to reach a tipping point that changes the cultural frame. The same with Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine's just the war in our face on the news. There are wars going on all over the place. Even on city streets in the United States, certainly, violence is endemic. So what changes that? Well, not religion, right? Not, the only thing that can change that is the realization that we're all, it sounds so trite, but we're all one. I am my brother and my sister's keeper. Yes. I am responsible for you.
Yes.
I'll just give you, I'm going on a little long here, but let me just give you an example. This is a silly one maybe, but it meant something to me at the time. I have a podcast. I work for Spirituality and Health magazine. And one of the things I do for them is I run their bi-weekly podcast called Spirituality and Health podcast, very creative name. And I was doing an interview with Matthew Ricard, who's one of the most famous Tibetan Buddhists alive today. And he's written a number of fabulous books on Tibetan Buddhism. And the one we were talking about when I was interviewing him was his book on animal rescue. There's a tradition in Tibet where you rescue animals in danger. And then we ended up talking about compassion for animals in general. And I mentioned that, what I don't know how I brought it up, but like, what about ants? When the season comes where the ants are all crawling through the walls into my bathroom in my house, I tend to squish them. And I realize that's wrong. Intellectually, I go, no, that's not right. But I do it without even thinking. And so he started to talk to me about the consciousness of an ant and how the ant is sentient, not the same way you and I are, but the ant is aware and does suffer, and even suffers. And I don't know what the biology is of this, but as I bring my finger down to kill the ant, you can see the ant's trying to make a run for it. It's trying to escape. And so Ricard says, be aware of that. Just be aware of that fact that this creature suffers. And as soon as we hung up, and the next time the ant came, I couldn't do it because I realized who the ant was. The ant was my sister. The ant was my brother. The ant was another manifesting of the divine, equal to, in some way, no less or no more than I am. And I no longer had whatever the knee-jerk reaction was to squish them. I no longer did that. I mean, mostly I left them alone because they really weren't doing anything damaging, I don't think. But if I thought there was a problem, then I would scoop them up on a piece of paper and take them outside and do that rather than murder them. And that didn't require enlightenment. That required some level of awareness.
Yes.
So anyway, there are things we can do even before we manage to reach that great awakening.
Right. Those kinds of encounters that kind of wake us up, there's very little in our culture that rewards that kind of interaction, those kinds of conversations that we can have with each other. I'm wondering about your own experience of intrigue and then pursuit of the non-dual reality. Like, what drove you to that? Because you do have a consciousness of that, even if you wouldn't claim awakening.
Right.
And it seems to me that that's key to any of us understanding this moment in history and our evolution.
Yeah. So you're asking me how I came to that?
Yeah. Or why do you identify that as such a key part? And it seems to be foundational to where you.
Yeah, it's foundational to who I am, I guess.
Yeah.
But it came to me rather than me coming to it. I mean, I first learned about Zen meditation when I was around 16, and I read it in a book. I read this book by Christmas Humphreys, who was the head of I think it was the Buddhist Society of London. I may have the name wrong. But I read this book, Zen Comes West, and he tells you how to sit Zazen. So, I just did what he said in the book. And I was visiting a friend on the summer between junior and senior year of high school. And I'm just doing what I read in the book. I'm meditating, whatever, on the shore of a lake in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And something happened. I wasn't there when it happened. I mean, literally, Rami disappeared. So I don't know what happened. But when it passed, I felt an absolute union with everything. And I felt this love from and this love for the universe. I mean, that faded after a while, right? But it wasn't something that I knew was possible. I just read how to sit. It wasn't something that I set out to experience. I just was sitting. But it came to me, and it's come to me multiple times since. So I've just been lucky that way, blessed that way, graced that way. I love to practice. My primary practice is mantra, chanting and repeating sacred names. My corollary practice is sitting, silent sitting. And I just like doing them. I feel better when I do them, and I feel really off if for some reason I skip a day, though I can't remember in the recent years when I've missed a day, but I may have. But if I went for a couple of days, that would really throw me. So I just do it because I enjoy doing it. The fact that I will tell myself that it primes the pump for these other experiences to happen, and they happen by grace, like I said, not by my effort, is just icing on the cake. I like doing them, but I didn't seek them out. Once you have them, though, they're unshakable. The same thing with my experiences with the Divine Mother. I couldn't deny what I was experiencing. It didn't fit any theological frame that I had. I just wasn't into any kind of formed deity, but I couldn't get rid of her. I mean, I tried. I just couldn't shake it. So now I've made my peace with her and allow those experiences to happen. And I see them, as it was explained to me by my friend Andrew Harvey, that if the reality is truly non-dual, it includes everything, including the dual, including forms. I'm always into the Godhead without form. That's my first focus. But when I started experiencing God or goddess in form, once I got over the dualistic, wait, I'm in no form, this is form, I can't have both, and realized that non-dualism makes room for both, then I could be at peace with what was happening, and I chant to her in different forms every day. And sometimes things happen, sometimes they don't, but I do it because I like doing it. But I no longer struggle with what happens in my spiritual life. I just accept whatever it is. And some of it is quite bizarre.
So
I don't want to make too much of it, and I don't.
Yeah.
But I try to just, okay, that was interesting. Let's let it go.
Just note that down. Come back to that later.
Maybe there's another book there. Who knows?
Right. Yes. I'm sitting with, and just want to honor in the conversation how many people, when we think about spirituality, many of us name experiences that we had, often by ourselves, often sitting, sometimes walking, almost always in nature. And there is this disappearing, this fading of self, and then this radical expansion of and almost instant integration, if you will, sort of it isn't just a conscious awareness of oneness. It is becoming the oneness.
Yeah. That's so well put. Yeah. Thank you.
And it's awkward to language.
Yeah, but you did it. You did it really well. Yeah.
So maybe part of as we're thinking about what is ours to do in this moment, it is that opening to that wondering and to being graced by that experience that we could each take responsibility for our own work on our moving past dualism as our primary mindset.
Yeah, or just realizing that there's a greater non-dualism that holds the dualism, so you don't actually have to struggle with the dualistic. You just go, okay, and there's more. So,
yeah,
but okay, I don't want to talk over you, but okay, okay. I just wanted to say something else about this, that it doesn't have to be a pleasant experience, like I'm sitting or I'm walking in nature or something. I think that there's a great wisdom, spiritual wisdom, in 12-step practice, especially the 12-step notion of rock bottom. Rock bottom is, to me, is like the 12-step version of dark night of the soul. And I think when you look at what's going on around the globe, environmentally, militarily, all the rest of that, I think we're in a dark night of human civilization, or even maybe greater than human civilization. We're in a dark night, what the Kali Yuga, whatever you want to call it. And it's rock bottom in a very, in a global way. And rock bottom is existential. I mean, if anyone's listening who's in a program and knows the experience of rock bottom can be, I don't want to simplify it or certainly not romanticize it, but rock bottom can be the best thing that ever happened to you. That there's this great crucifixion of the ego. You know, in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill W. says the first thing we have to do is stop playing God. And if you look at everything we've done to this planet and everything we do to one another, it's because we're playing God. I mean, Putin's playing God. The way we treat the environment, humans are playing God. We have to stop playing God, and we won't unless we're forced to. And that's what the dark night is. That's what, you know, the crucifixion is. What I love, I love religion in general. You can tell from the iconography behind me. All religions, all the major religions anyway, are represented. And what I love about them mostly is their story more than their theology, because I'm not a believer in much, if anything. But the stories are so meaningful. And one of the most powerful stories for our time is the Christian story of the crucifixion and the resurrection. And in the original gospel, and I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, but in the original gospel, which is Mark, Jesus only says one thing on the cross. He says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? I think it's from Psalm 22. And what I love about this is Jesus is on the cross. And what he's saying is the God of his understanding is dead to him, basically. It has forsaken him. There's nothing. Jesus's death on the cross is absolute. And there's nothing left for him to hold on to, and he dies. That's the last thing he says in the gospel according to Mark. And then the resurrection happens, but it doesn't happen because he's the Christ. It happens because this is my take, right? It happens because he went through the crucifixion, the dark night, the absolute collapse of everything he was clinging to. Humanity may be going through the same thing, and there has to be a crucifixion, and it's going to be horrifying. Hopefully not the sixth extinction, but it's going to be a massive crucifixion of, and all the gods that we cling to that have excused our abuse of one another and of the natural world for millennia. These gods, we're going to say, you know, why have you forsaken us? Because they no longer work. And they've forsaken us because they no longer work. And now we're free from them. And what happens when you're free? Well, then there's this resurrection into something else. Maybe that's the future of spirituality, if we're going to talk in those terms. We are being nailed to the cross of our own hubris and ignorance and violence and arrogance and fear. I mean, you can go on with the list. We're being nailed to that cross. If we have the courage to die on the cross, and maybe you have no choice, but let's just say, if we die on the cross, there is hope for humanity. If we manage to wriggle off and hold on to the madness that we call our religions and our gods and all the rest of it, we're just going to go deeper and deeper into rock bottom, and it may at some point be suicidal. And there is no grace of hitting rock bottom. There's just the horror and the tragedy of the end of human civilization. So I don't know, but my point is, this is not all sweetness and light. So many spiritual, and you could say in quotes, so many spiritual traditions are so saccharine. You know, everything is good. Everything is wonderful. There is no evil. Evil is just the absence of good. I don't even know what that means. Then good is just the absence of evil. I don't know, you know, this solipsisms. But, you know, we say all these things that really are meaningless statements, but keep us from the shadow side of our reality. And I think what has to happen, because at this point we have no choice, the shadow is erupting in such force as to cause, hopefully not, but possibly irreparable damage. And if we don't own that shadow, if we can't integrate it into the greater oneness, there is no hope for us. Anyway, I don't know where I was going with that, but there it is.
Well, talk about beautifully put. I could not agree more. And I think that is the moment that we're in. And so I'm thinking of John of the Cross, and as he talked about the dark night, it is this sense of abandonment by God, but it's actually ego abandoning all that it clings to actually open itself to the truth of our, of God and God's infinite form, and what all that means. I could talk to you for days. I would actually love to do that at some point, but let me ask you this one final question. If you, as you think about people who are listening to this conversation and needing some word that they could hold on to that serves as an anchor, serves maybe as a guide, maybe even a mantra actually, that could usher in the crucifixion and the resurrection, to hold the both. Is there any word that comes, or any saying?
Yeah. I mean, the way you put it was, when you added the word mantra, that's where my mind was going. I think that there is a practice for our time. There are lots of great practices, and I do lots of them. But if you're looking for the one thing that, from my opinion, the one practice that is essential to this moment in human either evolution or devolution, I don't know which way we're going, but a practice that might move us, evolutionarily, toward a higher level of consciousness. It is chanting / mantra. Either mantra is usually silent, chanting is usually out loud, but to me, they're sort of similar practices. And there's lots of mantra to choose from, but the one that I use is it's from the Hebrew Bible. It's Deuteronomy 4:35, I think. The Hebrew is Ein Od Milvado. So if you're spelling it out, it's EIN, that's Ein, Od is OD, and Milvado is MILVADO. And what it means is there's nothing but the divine. And you can read the text in Deuteronomy, and it seems to be saying, well, I'm the only God there is. Like when the Muslims will say, La ilaha illallah, there's no God but Allah. And mean by that there's just one God, and it's Allah, it's not Krishna or whatever. But the mystics, whether they're Sufi mystics in Islam or the Kabbalists and the Hasidim in Judaism, have a different read of these things. So when it says Ein Od Milvado, there's nothing but God, it's not that there's no God but our God. It's that there is literally nothing but God. You and I and the technology we're using and the books behind us and everything else is a manifesting of the divine. And by repeating that mantra over and over again, you begin to plant the seeds of that awareness in your consciousness. You can't make the transformation happen, but you can prime the pump. And this is one way to prime the pump. The corollary, if I got another couple of seconds, is to chant. And to chant in such a way as to get out of your head, to affect or to invite what St. Paul calls metanoia, change of mind, change of consciousness. Mantra will do that, but chanting, especially with others, and I'm thinking specifically of the kirtan style of chanting, where the leader chants a line and you repeat the line back to her. And it could be I've participated in kirtan that are from India and in Sanskrit, or from Judaism in Hebrew, and there's kirtan. You can do kirtan in Arabic from Islam. I mean, there's no tradition that can't be adapted to the kirtan style. But the thing with kirtan, unlike the mantra, which is sort of a settling process, the thing with kirtan is, I experience kirtan is it is ecstatic. And it does take you out of your normal waking state consciousness, the dual consciousness that is our problem, and lifts you almost against your will, if you allow it, which of course means will, but it lifts you almost against your will into this greater sense of non-duality, from which you feel compassion, toward which you feel love for all things. And these are two simple practices, though kirtan requires someone who knows what they're doing, I suppose, and a community to do with whom to do it. But mantra, you can just learn one and do it on your own. These are very simple practices that I think have the potential to save us.
I love it. Thank you for this conversation, for your wisdom, for your whole body of work that is a guide for all of us. So more to come, I hope.
My pleasure.